She thought she had me cornered. Karen, the HOA president with her clipboard and her smug smile, stood on my driveway, waving papers and declaring my garage was hers to seize. Neighbors laughed, phones recorded, everyone thought I was finished. They didn't know the truth. Behind that garage door wasn't junk, wasn't clutter. It was something that would shatter her world and flip the power dynamic forever. Because when Karen yanked that handle, the FBI rolled out into the sunlight. It started on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the air feels heavy with the weight of routine. The neighborhood sat still, rows of polished lawns and manicured hedges swaying lightly in the breeze. Yet in the middle of this suburban calm, a storm was brewing. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the homeowners association, stood at the edge of my driveway with her clipboard pressed against her chest like a badge of honor. Her eyes narrowed on the structure that stood beside my house, my garage. She called it an eyesore, though it was freshly painted, structurally sound, and neatly kept. To her, it wasn't about appearances. It was about control. That morning, she marched up my driveway with 2 other board members trailing behind her like shadows. Her voice cut through the calm air, carrying judgment, accusation, and the smug assurance of someone convinced she held power. She waved papers, official-looking notices that declared my garage in violation of the HOA bylaws. According to her, the structure wasn't compliant, wasn't approved, and therefore, didn't belong to me anymore. I stood silently, the weight of her words pressing down like a stone on my chest. To the neighbors peeking from behind curtains, it looked like I was cornered. A man about to lose his property to the iron grip of an HOA president who thrived on intimidation. Karen's smile widened when she sensed hesitation in my silence. She thrived on spectacle, loved it when the crowd gathered to witness her authority in action. She waved the papers higher, declaring that she would seize the garage if I didn't comply, that she had the full power of the board behind her. The humiliation stung. In that moment, it looked as if she had stripped away not just my rights, but my dignity. People whispered from their porches, nodding as though Karen's words were law, as though I was merely a tenant trespassing on her kingdom. She even told me she had already called for enforcement, a vague threat that carried enough weight to make the onlookers believe the matter was settled. Yet beneath the sting of that public shaming, beneath the burning anger that tightened in my chest, I felt something else, patience. Because I knew something Karen didn't. Behind the garage door she threatened to seize, a secret waited. A truth so heavy that it would shatter her illusion of power into 1,000 irretrievable pieces. But the moment wasn't yet. Not then, not with her basking in her victory and me swallowing the humiliation she thought she'd delivered. It wasn't time to reveal the cards I held. As Karen strutted back down my driveway, her clipboard hugged close like a trophy, I locked eyes with my neighbors. They looked at me with pity, some even with quiet relief that, for once, they weren't the target of her crusade. Their eyes said it all. He lost. She won. But what they didn't know, what no one in that crowd could have guessed, was that the garage wasn't just a garage. That behind its walls sat something powerful, something untouchable, something that didn't answer to Karen or her board. That morning ended with humiliation, yes. With whispers that I was about to lose the fight before it even began. But humiliation has a way of setting the stage for redemption. And soon enough, the very structure Karen tried to seize would open, not to surrender, but to reveal a force she could never control. The kind of reveal that would leave her trembling, silenced, and stripped of the authority she clung to. The stage was set. The audience was watching. And Karen had no idea she was walking straight into the story of her own downfall. The humiliation from that morning lingered long after Karen and her board members strutted away from my driveway. Neighbors whispered, their words trailing in the air like invisible smoke. Some were sympathetic, others quietly amused, but most simply turned away, relieved it wasn't their turn under Karen's spotlight. That was how she ruled, by fear and spectacle. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that my story didn't begin with a suburban home and a garage Karen wanted to claim. It stretched back decades, carved by sacrifice, service, and shadows I carried in silence. I was never the man who wore his past like a badge. I didn't parade accomplishments, didn't broadcast scars. To the people in this neighborhood, I was just another homeowner, a man who mowed his lawn on weekends and kept to himself. They saw ordinary. But the truth was far from ordinary. Years ago, before settling in this quiet community, I lived in a world where silence meant survival. I'd served in places where the ground shook from blasts, where the nights were filled with distant gunfire, and where trust was the rarest currency. I'd seen too much, carried too much. And when I came back home, I made a vow: never again would I live for spectacle or recognition. I wanted peace, simplicity, normalcy. So I bought this house. I built my garage with my own hands, every beam and bolt carrying the weight of my determination to start fresh. For me, the garage wasn't just storage. It was a sanctuary, a place where my past and present converged. And when the FBI approached me years later, asking for discreet cooperation, it became something more. It became a shield, a place where secrets could rest until the time came for them to rise. But Karen, she saw none of that. She saw only a target. To her, my silence was weakness. My refusal to argue on the driveway was surrender. And she used it. That same afternoon, she called another emergency HOA meeting. The word spread quickly. People showed up, not because they cared, but because Karen had a talent for turning boredom into drama. There she stood in front of her audience, waving the same notices she had shoved at me earlier, her words dripping with contempt. She told them my garage was illegal, that it threatened the property values of the entire neighborhood. She painted me as careless, rebellious, someone who thought himself above the rules. And the crowd murmured, some nodding, some shaking their heads, but all listening. I didn't attend the meeting. I heard about it through the grapevine, a neighbor who still had enough decency to whisper a warning as I took my trash out. "She's rallying them against you," he said, his eyes darting nervously as though Karen could hear him. That was Karen's strength. She fed off the humiliation of others, making their downfall her currency. And I became her latest project. The truth is, I could have stopped it then. I could have shut her down with one phone call, could have revealed the truth about the garage and what it held. But patience is a soldier's ally. Timing is everything. And exposing the cards too early would only weaken their impact. So I stayed quiet. I endured the humiliation, even as flyers circulated around the neighborhood painting me as non-compliant, even as whispers reached my ears about fines and forced removal. Each insult stung, each lie twisted the knife deeper, but I bore it with the discipline carved into me years ago. What Karen didn't know, what no one could fathom, was that humility wasn't weakness. It was a weapon. I thought about the nights overseas when I watched comrades stand tall against insurmountable odds, when silence wasn't cowardice but strategy. And I reminded myself, this was no different. Karen was loud because she thought she had power. Real power didn't need noise. Real power waited. The humiliation from that day wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Every sneer, every whisper, every smug glance from Karen and her followers only added weight to the coming reveal. And though they saw me as the underdog, as the man cornered by a clipboard and HOA bylaws, what they didn't see was the storm gathering quietly behind my garage door. A storm that would roll out not with words, but with the kind of authority even Karen couldn't dismiss. Because sometimes the most underestimated man in the room is the one holding the heaviest truth. And Karen was about to learn that lesson in the most unforgettable way. By the time the sun rose the following week, Karen had already sharpened her next attack. The flyers had done their work. Neighbors whispered about me at mailboxes, casting glances that felt like daggers. But Karen wasn't satisfied with whispers. She wanted a spectacle, one that would not only shame me but cement her grip on the community. That Saturday morning, she orchestrated her grand performance. It started small, a few HOA board members strolling down the street with clipboards, pointing toward my garage, scribbling notes with exaggerated gestures. Then came the crowd. Families from down the block gathered, some dragging lawn chairs onto sidewalks, others clutching coffee mugs as though settling in for a show. Phones appeared in hands, cameras pointed toward my driveway like a courtroom gallery waiting for judgment. Karen arrived last, of course, timing her entrance to perfection. She wore her authority like armor, sunglasses perched atop her head, clipboard hugged to her chest, and a smirk so sharp it could cut glass. Her voice carried across the cul-de-sac before she even reached my property. "There it is," she declared, pointing at my garage as if it were a criminal caught red-handed. "The violation I've been warning you all about. The structure that drags down our values and mocks our rules." The crowd shifted, murmuring, nodding. Some even chuckled under their breath, amused at the drama but unwilling to resist Karen's iron grip. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking questions, and parents hushed them with nervous glances in my direction. Karen thrived on the tension. She fed off it, raising her voice louder, theatrically slapping papers against her clipboard. "This garage is unauthorized, non-compliant, a blight on this neighborhood. And today," she paused, letting her words hang heavy in the air like thunderclouds, "we begin the process of seizing it." Laughter broke out from a few in the back, sharp and mocking. Someone muttered, "About time," and others agreed, their words catching in the wind. Cameras zoomed in, capturing my face, searching for cracks of panic or desperation. But I didn't move. I stood near the edge of my lawn, arms folded, gaze steady, calm, silent. That silence unnerved some, but Karen interpreted it as weakness. She pressed harder, stepping onto my driveway without hesitation. Her heels clicked against the pavement, each step a declaration of ownership. She stopped at the garage door, running her hand across it as though she already held the deed. "Do you see this?" She turned back to the crowd, gesturing at my property. "This is what happens when you let arrogance fester. When one man thinks he's above the rest of us. He built this without approval, without permits, and now it will be ours to correct. We will tear it down, brick by brick, if necessary." The crowd buzzed louder, emboldened by her confidence. Phones tilted higher, recording every moment. Some even laughed outright, shouting small insults. "Should have followed the rules. What did he think would happen?" I felt their eyes bore into me, searching for a reaction, hungry for drama. But I gave them nothing. My silence wasn't surrender. It was the tightening of a bowstring, the waiting breath before thunder splits the sky. Karen, unsatisfied, decided to drive the knife deeper. She pointed directly at me. "You," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You stand there silent, thinking you can ignore us. But silence is guilt. Silence is proof that you know you're wrong. And let me make it clear, if you don't surrender this garage today, we'll bring in enforcement. You will be fined. You will be humiliated. And when this is over, you'll wish you had never tried to defy this community." The crowd gasped, some nodding in approval, others whispering nervously. Someone laughed again, cruel and sharp. Another muttered, "He's finished." Karen's smirk widened, feeding off their reactions. She turned back toward the garage door, her hand resting on the handle as though she might open it herself. "Shall we take a peek?" she teased, her words laced with mockery. "Let's see what this man is hiding inside." The crowd erupted with excitement. Cameras zoomed closer, neighbors whispering with wide eyes. "What's in there? Probably junk. Maybe illegal stuff." The speculation swirled, growing louder, building suspense until the air itself seemed to vibrate with tension. I stood still, silent, calm. Inside me, a storm churned, memories of battlefields, of standing against far greater forces than a smug HOA president. I had faced men with weapons, nations divided by war, shadows that hunted in silence. Karen, with her clipboard and her arrogance, was nothing compared to that. And yet, the patience those battles had carved into me held firm. Because I knew what waited behind that door. Karen thought silence was weakness, but in that silence, I held power. A secret so heavy it could crush her empire of control in a heartbeat. The crowd laughed, jeered, pointed. Phones recorded, eager for a downfall. And Karen stood tall, basking in her moment of triumph. But triumph built on arrogance is fragile. And Karen had no idea that with one turn of that garage handle, her entire world would collapse. The stage was set. The cameras were rolling. And soon, the humiliation she had poured onto me would recoil like a whip, striking her harder than she could ever imagine. The neighborhood held its breath as Karen's hand lingered on the garage handle. She turned slowly toward the crowd, letting the anticipation thicken, feeding off the tension like an actor milking the climax of a play. "Let's see what secrets he's hiding," she said, her voice loud enough for every camera, every neighbor, every whispering mouth to hear. The crowd leaned forward, phones lifted higher, recording the moment she believed would seal my humiliation forever. I didn't move. My eyes stayed steady, calm, as if carved from stone. Inside me, though, a clock ticked down. The moment I had been waiting for was about to arrive. Karen yanked the handle. The garage door groaned as it rolled upward, a slow metallic sound that seemed to stretch time itself. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The sunlight poured into the dark space like a spotlight, and for a split second, there was silence. Then, movement. Figures stepped into the light. Not dusty boxes or broken furniture, not the clutter Karen had promised the neighborhood they would find. No. What emerged was order, precision, power. The first man wore black tactical gear, an unmistakable badge glinting on his chest. Behind him, another appeared, then another, each one carrying the weight of federal authority. The bold yellow letters across their backs told the story in 4 sharp characters: FBI. The crowd froze. The laughter evaporated. Phones, once held with smug certainty, now shook in trembling hands. Murmurs broke out, confused, fearful, disbelieving. Karen staggered back a step, her smirk dissolving, clipboard trembling in her grip. What is this?" she stammered, her voice no longer commanding, but cracking. The lead agent stepped fully into view, his gaze sweeping across the crowd with practiced sharpness. He gave a single nod in my direction. And in that moment, the weight shifted. The man Karen had painted as weak, defiant, and guilty now stood revealed as something far more than she had ever imagined. The FBI agents moved with quiet precision, some rolling out heavy cases on steel wheels, others carrying files sealed in evidence containers. It was not chaos, it was control. The kind of control Karen could never dream of wielding. The crowd gasped again as more agents filed out, filling my driveway, their presence undeniable, their authority unquestionable. Neighbors who had once whispered mockery now whispered something else: awe, fear, respect. Karen tried to speak, but her words collapsed in her throat. This isn't, you can't." She trailed off as one agent turned toward her, his badge gleaming, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed was louder than her shrillest accusations. For years, I had been the quiet man on the block, the one who kept to himself, who never bragged, never fought back with words. But what no one knew was that my garage wasn't just a garage. It was a secure operations site, a quiet partnership with federal authorities who trusted me enough to protect their work, to keep their presence hidden until the time came. And now that time had come. The underdog they mocked, the man they thought weak, now stood shoulder to shoulder with the very agents sworn to uphold the highest level of law. The same garage Karen tried to seize became the stage for her undoing. Phones lowered. Mouths hung open. Even the boldest of the whisperers fell silent as reality crashed down like a thunderclap. Karen's face drained of color. The clipboard slipped from her grip, clattering uselessly against the pavement. Her authority, once so untouchable in this neighborhood, dissolved like mist in the sunlight. The lead agent glanced at me again, his expression steady, professional, but behind his eyes was recognition. Respect. It was the kind of acknowledgement Karen had craved for years, but it was mine, and mine alone. The power dynamic flipped so violently that the entire street seemed to tilt. Neighbors who had once nodded along with Karen's accusations now stepped back, uneasy, their eyes darting between her trembling frame and the line of agents now filling my driveway. Some even turned off their phones, ashamed of what they had recorded. What was once a spectacle of humiliation had become a theater of reckoning. And I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence now roared louder than Karen's shrieks ever could. The truth had exploded into the open, and there was no going back. Karen had tried to seize my garage. She thought it was her greatest victory. But instead, it became the doorway through which the FBI rolled out, and with them, the undeniable proof that the man she tried to crush was never ordinary. The underdog was gone. The quiet man had risen. And Karen, for the first time, understood what it felt like to be powerless. The moment the FBI agents rolled out of my garage, the entire neighborhood seemed to fall into stunned silence. The only sounds were the clicking of tactical boots on concrete and the metallic rattle of cases being wheeled into position. The show Karen had staged so carefully had turned into something else entirely, a trial, but not mine. Neighbors who had once whispered mockery now stood wide-eyed, caught between fear and awe. Some slowly lowered their phones, as if realizing the recordings they'd hoped would capture my downfall had instead documented Karen's humiliation. Others held on, but with trembling hands, their devices no longer symbols of entertainment, but evidence of their complicity in her cruelty. Karen herself looked hollow, her face pale and twisted in disbelief. The clipboard she had once clutched like a sword lay abandoned at her feet. She reached for words, but none came. Her lips moved silently, her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, but her voice, that voice that had ruled over this neighborhood for so long, had abandoned her. The lead agent took a single step toward her, his gaze sharp and unyielding. He didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. The authority that radiated from him shattered whatever illusion of power Karen still tried to cling to. And in the center of it all, I remained still, calm, silent. Because true power doesn't shout. True power doesn't wave papers or demand obedience. True power simply is. Whispers surged through the crowd, desperate, confused. Is this real? One neighbor breathed. He's working with the FBI, another muttered. Oh my God, all this time. Their voices rose and fell like waves, shock rippling outward until the entire block seemed to hum with disbelief. Some gasped audibly when one agent glanced at me and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Others exchanged guilty looks, remembering the times they had joined Karen in mocking me, believing her stories, siding with her authority. The weight of shame settled on them like a heavy cloak. Karen staggered back a step, her body language unraveling. She raised her hands slightly, as though to defend herself from the invisible blows of judgment now raining down on her. I didn't, she stammered, her voice finally breaking into the air. I didn't know. But the crowd wasn't listening to her anymore. Their focus had shifted. For the first time, their eyes weren't on Karen. They were on me. Not with pity. Not with mockery. But with something new. Respect. It wasn't the loud kind, not applause or cheers. It was quieter, deeper, the kind that lives in silence and heavy stares. The kind that acknowledges a man they thought small was in fact far greater than they had ever imagined. And I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice, didn't point at Karen or laugh at her crumbling empire of arrogance. I simply stood, arms folded, the calm at the center of the storm. Because justice doesn't need theatrics. Justice simply waits for its moment. The agents moved with precision, some entering vehicles parked discreetly along the street, others rolling equipment back inside. It was clear their business extended far beyond this HOA drama. I was only their contact, their guardian of space. But in that moment, their presence was enough to dismantle the entire illusion Karen had built around her authority. She had tried to paint me as weak. Now she was exposed as powerless. The whispers of the crowd grew sharper, colder. She humiliated him for nothing. She lied to us. All this time, and she never had any real power. Karen's shoulders sagged under the weight of their words. She bent down to grab her clipboard, but her hands trembled so badly it slipped from her grip again, clattering against the pavement. Each sound echoed her unraveling. The humiliation she had poured onto me now soaked her instead, and it was merciless. And I didn't need to say a word. Because sometimes silence is the sharpest blade. The crowd's eyes lingered on me, as though trying to reconcile the man they had mocked with the one who stood calmly beside federal agents. And though none of them clapped, though no applause filled the air, the shift was undeniable. Their respect wasn't loud, but it was real. Karen finally turned to retreat, her bravado shattered, her power reduced to ash. The very neighbors she once controlled avoided her gaze, stepping aside as she passed. Her walk of triumph had become a walk of shame. And as she disappeared down the sidewalk, the lesson lingered heavy in the air. Authority built on arrogance collapses when it collides with truth. Justice had begun to unfold, and though it wasn't finished, its presence was undeniable. The man Karen thought she could break had revealed his quiet strength. And in that revelation, everything changed. The silence that followed Karen's retreat felt heavier than any words could have carried. For years, her voice had been the loudest in the neighborhood, slicing through conversations like a blade, dictating what was acceptable, who belonged, and who did not. But now, her footsteps faded into the distance, and for the first time, the street belonged to silence, not hers. The FBI agents finished their work methodically, their movements calm, professional, and unshaken by the spectacle they had just disrupted. To them, it was routine, another day of order and duty. But to the neighbors, it was extraordinary. The ordinary man they had overlooked had just been revealed as someone who carried a weight of respect and trust beyond their comprehension. I stood quietly at the edge of my driveway, my arms still folded. Not once had I raised my voice, not once had I needed to. My calm had outlasted Karen's fury, and now it commanded the space she once thought was hers alone. Neighbors who had filmed my supposed downfall now lowered their phones in shame. A few tapped their screens hurriedly, deleting clips they no longer wanted to exist. What they had recorded wasn't my humiliation, it was Karen's. And none of them wanted to be remembered as her chorus. One by one, eyes turned toward me. Not with pity this time, not with amusement, but with something closer to reverence. For years, they had seen me as a quiet recluse, a man content to fade into the background of suburban life. Now they saw something else, a man who had carried silence not as weakness, but as strength. A man who had endured. A man who had been underestimated too long. The murmurs shifted in tone, no longer mocking, no longer doubtful. They carried awe, curiosity, even regret. All this time, someone whispered, shaking their head. He never said a word, another added. And she thought she could take him down? The transformation spread like ripples on water. Where once there had been jeers, now there was respect. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was silence heavy with recognition. Even the children, who had laughed along with Karen's theatrics only an hour earlier, now stared with wide eyes. To them, the lesson was simpler but just as profound. The man they thought powerless had become the strongest figure they had ever seen on their street. Karen's allies, the board members who had trailed behind her with clipboards and smug nods, now stood awkwardly apart, their authority crumbling. Without her, they were exposed, their silence condemning. The crowd didn't look to them anymore. No one cared what their papers said or what bylaws they quoted. Their credibility had shattered the moment Karen fled under the shadow of her own arrogance. And in the vacuum she left behind, respect settled over me like a mantle. I didn't move to seize it. I didn't raise my voice or call for applause. I simply let it be. Because recognition that is forced is fragile. True respect grows in silence, in the quiet realization that what you thought you knew was wrong. That evening, as the FBI agents departed, they gave no speeches, no explanations. They left as quietly as they had appeared, their convoy disappearing down the road until the neighborhood was still again. Yet their presence lingered, stamped into the memory of everyone who had seen it. As night fell, the street felt different. Porch lights flicked on one by one, but there was no laughter, no gossip. Instead, a hush carried from house to house, broken only by the occasional murmur of disbelief. People stepped carefully now, their eyes darting toward my garage with something closer to respect than suspicion. The garage they once mocked, the building Karen tried to seize, now stood like a monument. Not an eyesore, not a violation, but a symbol. A reminder of what happens when arrogance collides with truth. And me. I remained as I always had been, calm, steady, quiet. I didn't need to boast, didn't need to reclaim my dignity with words. The truth had done it for me. The man who had been laughed at, pitted, mocked behind curtains, was no longer the underdog. He was the figure they now measured themselves against. The neighbor who carried an untold story heavier than any HOA bylaw could ever touch. Karen lost more than her credibility that day. She lost her grip. The empire of fear she had built on intimidation and spectacle collapsed the moment real authority appeared. Her absence now left the neighborhood freer, quieter, more cautious of judgment. The balance had shifted. And though the street would return to its routines, the lawns trimmed, the mailboxes checked, the truth of that day would never be forgotten. The story of Karen's downfall and the silent man's quiet strength would echo in whispers for years to come. Because sometimes, justice doesn't roar in the courtroom or thunder through speeches. Sometimes justice arrives in silence, rolling out through garage doors and standing quietly beside the man no one saw coming. And that silence, once mistaken for weakness, had become the loudest sound the neighborhood would ever remember. The street never forgot that day. For weeks afterward, whispers replaced the gossip that once filled the air. People spoke in hushed tones at the mailbox, glancing toward my house with the kind of respect that doesn't need applause to be real. Even the children, who once laughed at Karen's antics, grew quiet when they rode their bikes past my driveway. The story had planted itself deep, a living reminder of what happens when arrogance collides with truth. But beyond the spectacle, beyond the shock of FBI agents stepping into the light, the heart of the story was something greater. It was not about badges, or authority, or the humiliation of one woman's downfall. It was about the quiet truth that lives inside every underestimated soul. Karen had built her power on appearances, the clipboard, the sharp words, the loud voice. To her, strength was control. Power was spectacle. Respect was fear. And she had wielded all three mercilessly, convinced that no one could ever challenge her throne. But true power never brags. True power doesn't parade itself in front of neighbors or wave papers in the air. True power waits. It endures humiliation, it absorbs the weight of doubt, and it speaks only when the time is right. That was the lesson she never learned, and the one the neighborhood was forced to witness in painful clarity. Respect is not about appearances. It is not about who shouts the loudest, or who collects the most signatures, or who can bend the rules of a homeowners association to their will. Respect is about character. It is about the sacrifices no one sees, the battles fought in silence, the dignity carried even under the crushing weight of humiliation. Karen's downfall was dramatic, yes, but it was also inevitable. Because arrogance can never outlast patience. And control built on fear will always collapse when it collides with truth. The neighbors saw it. They felt it. They realized that the man they thought ordinary was anything but. And in their silence, they acknowledged the truth. Never underestimate anyone. Because you never know the weight someone carries behind their calm. You never know the storms they've weathered, the scars they keep hidden, the sacrifices they've made in shadows no one else has walked through. And sometimes, the quietest among us are the ones holding the heaviest truths. The garage became a symbol of that lesson. What was once mocked as an eyesore became a monument of patience and justice. Every time a neighbor passed by, they saw not just a building, but a reminder: appearances deceive, but truth does not. As for Karen, her empire of fear crumbled that day. Without the crowd's laughter to fuel her, without the clipboard to disguise her insecurities, she was left only with silence, the same silence she had once mistaken for weakness. And in that silence, she was forced to face herself. The story didn't need a courtroom verdict or a police siren to feel complete. The justice was already written in the eyes of the people who finally saw clearly. And for me, I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. Because victory is not about standing on the ashes of your enemy. True victory is knowing you remained steady, calm, and dignified, even when the world tried to strip you down. The moral is simple, yet it carries the weight of every sacrifice made in silence. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Respect is not about appearances, it is about truth. True power is silent, steady, and unshaken. Honor is not given, it is earned through sacrifice. The neighborhood learned it. Karen learned it. And perhaps, anyone who carries this story forward will feel it too. So when you find yourself mocked, underestimated, or dismissed by those who mistake noise for strength, remember this. Silence can be the sharpest weapon. Patience can be the strongest shield. And truth, when revealed, will always outshine arrogance. That day on the driveway wasn't about me, or Karen, or even the FBI. It was about something larger. A lesson carved into the lives of everyone who witnessed it, a story that would echo long after the garage door closed again. Never underestimate anyone. Because the person you laugh at today may carry the kind of power that humbles you tomorrow. And when that day comes, the silence you once mocked will be the silence that leaves you trembling.